Myself, I'm Sébastien Treyer. I'm the director of IDDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, based in Paris. And I will be the moderator of this session of a handover of the T7. I think we could open the session now. And I just want to welcome all of you to this handover meeting, which is actually also the launching of activities of the T7 for 2026. And it's a pleasure to welcome so many of you from around the world. We are gathered for this formal handover of the T7 from Canada, and we are very fortunate to have with us the Canadian Sherpa, Deputy Minister Cindy Termorhuizen, but also Paul Sampson, the President of CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, who led the T7 last year, to which I was fortunate to contribute under the leadership of IISD on a task force on the environment. So we look forward to hearing from them the wisdom and the lessons that they have collected during this year of Canada's presidency and their advice on the way forward. Let me just mention that continuity matters on the T7, in particular when there might be lots of disruptions on the political side, on the G20 or on the G7 also. So we would not also, other point that is important, we would not be starting this T7 on the right footing if we did not have the opportunity to hear from the French authorities their priorities for their starting presidency. And many thanks to Raphaël Noiret, the head of the G7, G20 mission, and Tristan Auro, head of policy planning, both from the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs in France, for being with us today. At IDDRI, we are really thrilled to accompany the G7 this year, and we believe that together with ECFR, our partner in this endeavor, thank you so much also to ECFR colleagues and to you, Susie, for accepting that we work together. We have gathered an amazing range of think tanks and research centers to support the development of concrete recommendations to the G7. As you will hear later from Céline Kaufmann and Agathe Desmarais, we are proposing a very operational T7, building on the existing expertise from both G7 and non-G7 countries. With this, I'm glad to hand over the floor to our co-pilot, ECFR. And to do so, I'm happy to welcome Susie Dennison, Senior Director for Talent and Transformation at ECFR, the European Centre on Foreign Relations.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and it's great to be here as part of this initiative. We're at ECFR also very proud to be co-chairing with you, IDDRI, the Think 7 process for the coming year, and we hope to be able to build on the achievements of the skilled chairmanship that CIGI has carried out under the Canadian presidency over the last year. For us at ECFR, the G7 is absolutely central to our agenda for 2026. We are, as so many of you that have joined today, I'm sure, very focused on what the new international order means, or as our director, Mark Leonard, likes to call it, the new international unorder. In which we find ourselves. And we believe that in a world in which competition is fierce and in which everything can be weaponized diplomatically, the G7 is going to be playing an even more crucial role as the body at the intersection between economics and diplomacy, and as a body for driving forward global goods and indeed the sort of the virtue of international cooperation in its own right. So we're very excited about what the T7 can do on that front. It comes also at a very timely moment for us as ECFR, as we are building up our work on geoeconomics and tech more broadly. So we're very pleased to be able to complement IDDRI's co-leadership on development financing and industrial policy with a focus on economic security and innovation and technology. This is a real opportunity for us to be able to bring to the T7 process that intellectual process which we wanted to focus on in 2026 anyway. So we're very excited about what this can all bring forward, and looking forward to working with everybody here today in making the T7 a success. We're very keen, as I know you are, IDDRI, to push for real practical outcomes, implementable recommendations, and we are and we will bring hopefully the intellectual firepower from our areas of work to that process with ambition and with drive. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you very much, Susie. And I believe the participants to this webinar this afternoon is also testimony to the fact that one of the values of the T7 is its reach in many countries around the world to show the support of the very practical and concrete ideas that we can recommend that are challenged and discussed from various perspectives, geographical, but also from different situations. Now that in the next moment, I will give the floor to Paul Sampson, President of CIGI, the Center for International Governance and Innovation, to have a retrospective look on the Canadian Think 7, the Canadian T7, and also formally proceed to the handover to France of the T7 presidency. So Paul, you have the floor for the next 10 minutes. Paul, I don't know if you're in a capacity. Yes.
Now the host just let me start my video. Hello,
great.
Everyone. Great. Thank you very much for that great start to this. I'm Paul Sampson, and part of this conclusion of Canada's 2025 cycle where we're passing the baton on to France. I want to start today, and I'm very pleased that so many think tanks are here, as well as these senior officials from France and Canada. Thank you for joining us. I want to begin by recognizing the people that were involved in the Think 7 for Canada this year. We had chairs and co-chairs and authors and reviewers and a really strong secretariat. We produced more than 20 policy briefs across multiple topics. And we had thinkers from many different countries, well beyond the G7, as you would expect for a set of global issues. So I think most importantly, we helped move forward what the objective of the Think 7 is, and that is creating a practical bridge between rigorous analysis, policy relevance, and delivering that with a timetable and in the format that leaders can use, and others, of course, across the network. So I think it really matters the format of what we do, and I'm glad to see that the emphasis is on practical recommendations. So what are some reflections of what happened over 2025 that I put on the table here? I think in a way there was an unofficial theme for our year. We never had an official theme, but in reality, it quickly turned into the notion of governance in a fragmented world. That was, how do you make something like the G7 maximize its impact? How would we advise on that at a time when geopolitical coercion, persistent conflicts, and systemic economic shocks were alongside accelerating technological change? So in a way, kind of everything was happening at once. But our overall message, I think, was clear in that the values and institutions that shaped the post-war order need to remain relevant. How do you do that? How do you adapt to that complexity without abandoning core democratic principles? And so that was, that was the challenge for the T7 and for broader governance in the last year. It's definitely a balance, and I think that we approached it as, if I could describe it as, with pragmatism for sure, but not in the sense of a compromise. I think there was still a strategy to keep pathways open for broader coalitions, even beyond the G7. And I think that the G20 remains relevant here in that the G7 can do very little on its own. So a lot of what the G7 needs to do actually bridges to the G20. And I think that furthered very much what our approach was. Now, a word on each one of the 4 task forces that we had. We had 4 task forces across technology, digital economy, environment and energy, and security. And they were intentionally done with a fair amount of linkage between them. We recognized that they were not in isolation, that in fact, many of the key variables were ones where they intersected. To take them one at a time here briefly, the first one was transformative technologies, a specific focus on AI and quantum. And the message here was that these technologies are no longer peripheral. They're right at the intersection of sovereignty, security, economic competitiveness, as well as rights and trust. And we're seeing that play out, continue to play out, and continue to hit all of those intersection points. I think one thing that emerged was that there are ways to develop common evaluation processes. There's an emphasis on resilience of supply chains, and these kinds of issues came out of our discussion in a general way on technology. There was also a normative part to it, and that was that democratic countries should champion innovation that is rights-based, has transparency as part of it, and is aligned with public accountability, not just to go down a tech road that is faster and more powerful without these. The second task force was on digitalization of the global economy. Here, the core diagnosis came out as really around the issue of governance lag, that data driving trade and innovation, cross-border rules are still very nascent or fragmented. And so these digital assets and other elements in the new digital economy are coming fast. Think of stable coins and tokenization. They're moving much faster than the regulatory frameworks. And the interoperability is a question, but also what are the guardrails or the rule book associated with it. On the issue of environment, energy, and sustainable development, which was the third task force, the central point there that came out was about the implementation gap. So there's been insufficient progress on GHG emissions. We've underdelivered on finance commitments, and therefore there is an eroding public trust. The challenge is going to be practical. How do we move forward and unlock some climate finance, looking at things like debt, linking it to high levels of debt in developing countries, perhaps improving the alignment of multilateral development bank lending, which is sometimes more fragmented than it should, clean energy supply chains, etc. So there's still quite a bit to do there. And I think it's going to be really important that credible action continues to move forward, because that trust has gone down definitely. So the challenges remain and the trust has weakened. The fourth area, the fourth task force we had was global peace and security. And the work here underscored the erosion of global security norms and the growing indivisibility of economic and traditional security or military power. That's not new, but the indivisibility, I think, has become even clearer over this last year. The critical infrastructure elements, the supply chains, how dual use technologies are used. It's very much an era of strategic competition. And one thing that came out of this was where multilateral systems are not fully delivering, let's say, there was often mention of agile multilateral coalitions, or so that could be in the form of a mini-lateral, right? So not like as a full replacement for multilateral, but something that would be more focused on a specific issue and get around this blocked consensus at the multilateral level. So as we're handing over to France, I want to be explicit about a couple of tensions that I think continue to exist, and then we're going to move to the formal handover here. I'm going to note three quick tensions. The first one is, to what degree does the G7 and the advice that we're looking at as think tanks, to what degree should we focus on the G7 as kind of a stabilizer versus a reformer in the system? And I think it's a bit of both. I think on the one hand, the stabilizing element is really important in some areas where uncertainty is very high. Think of financial stability, debt, these kinds of things. That there is a stabilizer role for the G7 there. Same time, I think there is a reformer role in that the status quo is no longer. We need to come up with a new system which is reformed, which is different. It's not a status quo. And so we need to work on both of those tracks. Secondly, there's tension around openness versus security in the technology space. Question of open science and open models and interoperability can diffuse benefits, but it can also create some risks. I think the challenge here is picking one or the other. It is going to be a balance between those two. It's completely open source. There are going to be a lot of risks, but if it's a closed system, that is not going to work very well. So we'll need some kind of risk tiering approach to this. And then the third tension is the multilateral versus the mini-lateral, which I just mentioned a moment ago. So can we find a balance to continue to promote multilateralism, reform multilateralism, and in some cases use minilaterals where things are stuck that really need to move forward. So I think those two things can be approached at the same time. So what are the implications for the France handover? And let me now start to prepare the formal passing of the baton, which is a virtual one in my hand here, to colleagues at IDDRI and the ECFR. I think France inherits an agenda which is quite similar. It was already mentioned, continuity is going to be important on a lot of these emerging technology issues, global governance as a whole, the economy, climate finance, and security. These are all going to remain relevant. My advice would be to think about that systems lens being very important as well, which I think was applied quite well over this last year. And also to not think, and maybe this is the most important comment in a certain way, is to design recommendations that are assuming stress conditions, not normal conditions, right? We're not going back to the way things were before, and we're in this very unsettled world. So assume trade disruptions, cyber incidents, market volatility, capacity jumps in AI and things like that. Like assume that into what you're building for next year. So to our French colleagues, we are handing over a work in progress, but I think one that has made some steps forward. I really value the strength of this network of think tanks, and I think we are all finding it to be very, very important going forward here. And as was mentioned at the beginning, an important role for think tanks at this time when governments can't always formally meet on issues or convene as much as they would like. Think tanks may even have a more important role than usual here. So again, all the best to France. Here's the virtual baton that I am passing over. It was fantastic to work with you, and we continue to work with you this year, and all the best for 2026. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I would have loved to have the audience have a round of applause for your speech. Thank you so much, and I really welcome your words of being aware of these tensions that are inevitable and of the continuity that we need to have. So, thanks again. I received the baton with great enthusiasm, but also knowing the charge that it means. And Susie, please.
I also gratefully received the baton and also the challenge that I think, Paul, you've laid out so clearly with your framing, that given those tensions which are in front of all of us, we need to be as practical as possible and design recommendations that are up to that challenge. And yeah, I'm looking forward to doing that with the network.
Thank you so much again, Paul. That was really great to have you with us. I will now turn to Madame Sydney Termorshuysen, Deputy Minister for the G7 Summit and Sherpa for Canada for the G7 presidency by Canada in 2025. Madame Termorshuysen, the floor is yours for 10 minutes. We would be really interested to have some reflections on what happened in the G7 summit, but also the value that you see in having the T7 at your side. I hope you can hear me and that you can join. So I see that Madame Termorshuysen is online. Oh, yes. I think we're nearly there. You need to probably help Madame Termorshuysen to open the microphone if you can, colleagues.
There it goes.
That's it. Thank you so much to be with us. And please, the floor is yours.
It's embarrassing to have technological issues, especially in front of CIGI. But bonjour à toutes et à tous, et merci de m'avoir invité à dire quelques mots à l'occasion de cette cérémonie de passation. I know that we're speaking in English, but I thought a few French words were in order for our French hosts, and of course, as a bilingual country. Let me start by warmly congratulating Paul and CIGI for your very strong leadership and I think a very successful T7. And I think success, Paul, you framed it really well, but I think I would also say that Sébastien and Susie did as well, which is it's about practical concrete, thoughtful engagement. And that is exactly what we got from CIGI and the T7. So we're truly grateful. I would say that Canada has a pretty special relationship with the T7. Our collaboration goes back to 2018 when the T7 in its current form was set up as an engagement group under Canada's last G7 presidency. And so we're really pleased to, after this full cycle, in a way, come full circle and have a chance once again to pass this on to France. I think the T7's legacy has been enduring. It's really important, and I think Paul said it well, that you have that connection between the analytical think tank world and the policy challenges that governments are facing, and to have, I think, a real space of confidence and openness that exists between the T7 and the G7 governments that are hosting. Certainly, I felt that way this year, and I have to say that I was very grateful for the many conversations that we had, both in plenary, but also bilaterally with Paul and his team. So thank you for that. I also really valued the approach that CIGI took in terms of the thematics that they focused on, and I won't repeat them. Paul went through them very well, but I think they were chosen, I hope to think they were chosen as a way to practically align with what the presidency had decided to focus on, but also, of course, taking a more expansive view on this. The think tank should not be limited to the priorities of the governments that have the presidencies. That goes without saying. But when you do align your work with that, it enables us to use it in a more practical and direct way. And so that's very valuable for us. I was very grateful also to join the T7's summit in Waterloo, Ontario this year. Thank you again, Paul and CIGI, for inviting me. And I have to say the work that came out of that really informed our thinking as well. Let me say a few words about Canada's G7 presidency, partly a reminder of what we've accomplished, but also, I think Sébastien said it very well, one of the priorities, I think, is continuity. And so, Sébastien, I'm really pleased that you stressed that in your opening remarks, because I think our ability to build on work from year to year is, I think, what also gives impact to both the T7 and the G7 from a government perspective. So reflecting back on 2025, we're almost at the end of the year. Many of you have already talked about this. This year was defined very deeply by a high level of uncertainty and a great deal of complexity. And figuring out how you have a presidency and a focus that can still have impact is a real challenge. And I think the thought leadership that we got from CIGI and many others was instrumental in our ability to come up with practical outcomes. I'm pretty proud of the accomplishments of the G7 this year, despite everything. I think we've been able to do a lot of concrete things in the government space together. Just as a reminder, the G7's presidency had three broad priorities: to protect our communities in the world, to build energy security and accelerate the digital transition, and to secure the partnerships of the future. And under these three thematics, we were able to agree to 6 action-oriented leader statements, as well as a very time-sensitive statement on the Middle East. You'll recall what was happening in the middle of June. But the 6 statements that we worked on throughout the year and into which we received T7 input that was very helpful were a G7 critical minerals action plan, a G7 leaders statement on AI for prosperity, a Kananaskis common vision for the future of quantum technologies, a Kananaskis wildfire charter, a G7 leaders statement on transnational repression, and a G7 leaders statement on countering migrant smuggling. And what's been very interesting this year, and it was in some ways by happenstance because of Canada's election this year, many of our ministerials took place after the summit, which initially we thought was far from ideal. But the interesting thing is that it's provided a real opportunity to undertake intensive implementation work on leaders' commitments. So for instance, in the critical minerals space, we actually ended up with the critical minerals roadmap, which leaders had tasked ministers to deliver. They delivered that. And there were also $6.4 billion worth of deals and MOUs signed on the margins of the energy ministerial, which I think demonstrated the real possibility and the reality that the G7 plus can continue to work together and do practical things. Same thing in the AI for prosperity space. In fact, CIGI was just at the ministerial of the industry, digital, and tech ministers, where they produced some significant work around SME adoption, around public sector adoption. So some very good and concrete follow through that I think the T7 really contributed to. On quantum technologies, same thing. We're now seeing joint calls for proposal out of various groupings of G7 countries, recognizing the incredible importance and I think revolutionary nature of this technology and the need for us to continue to stay at the cutting edge. So I won't go through all of them, but I think my main point here is there haven't just been statements at a leaders summit. There's been critical follow through in the 6 months since the summit. And in fact, I think that is in part thanks to the inputs that we had from the T7. We were very grateful that CIGI was able to join one of the Sherpa meetings that we hosted in 2025 and provided some very thoughtful inputs, including on spaces on the technology side that some Sherpas and their teams were less familiar with. So there's also that expertise you bring to the table that can be really vital at key moments in discussions and in the development of policy. I will also say that on the peace and security side, I mentioned the Middle East briefly. We did not have leader-level outcomes on the peace and security side. Fortunately, there were besides the Middle East piece that I mentioned, there were significant ministerial outcomes, particularly in the foreign minister's track. But I will say that Ukraine was a very strong priority for Canada this year. Canada announced very significant measures in support of Ukraine at the G7 summit. You'll recall that we invited President Zelensky and the NATO Secretary General, and Ukrainian ministers were very regular features at ministerials in our G7 presidency. And I think that strong support on Ukraine, but also on other peace and security issues, is an area that I think we're very pleased we can continue on from previous presidencies. Let me just close by maybe making a couple of reflections on what I've learned, and I could spend the day with you talking about what I learned. But I think the moment that we faced in 2025 really demanded a focused economic and foreign policy agenda where practical cooperation and concrete outcomes could be achieved in a limited number of areas. We felt we needed to have that very focused agenda given our context, and that I think was borne out by the realities that we faced. At the same time, it was also very important that we not limit our discussions to those narrow areas where we thought we could achieve consensus. We had to have those closed door, frank discussions on things like where's the global trading order going, for instance, and leaders did discuss those issues behind closed doors. So I would just say I'm very excited to hear about some of the thematics that you in the think tank community are planning to focus on this year. I heard Susie talking about geoeconomics and tech and economic security. I mean, these are broad, difficult issues that we need to continue to tackle. And it's really, really important that the think tank community focus on those and help us think about the global unorder. I hadn't heard that term, and I'm going to remember it, and help us think through what that means and what our policy responses are. So I'm very pleased that you once again seem to be taking both that practical outcome-oriented approach within a much broader, thoughtful framework. I will also say I appreciated the way that CIGI approached their recommendations, which was putting them into a practical frame that recognized the reality that we were in as a presidency and the kind of recommendations that were feasible. I'm in no position to provide advice to our French T7 colleagues, but I would say that that kind of recommendations are easier for us to actually take on board and use. So to the extent you develop recommendations that you wish to see reflected in presidencies, really thinking about how they could practically be used is important. I would also say that for my French government colleagues online, I really think that having the think tank community present at some of the meetings, whether it's on the margins of ministerials or at Sherpa meetings, really enriches the discussion. So this is more for our French colleagues. I'd encourage you to think about that because I think that input is very helpful. And, you know, for instance, as Paul was talking about in the tech space, technology and the private sector are moving so much faster than government. The governance space is catching up, and having those inputs from outside of government are essential in that space, for instance, for us to actually be responding from a policy perspective to the world that exists. Finally, I would just say that I have really appreciated the informal conversations that I've had with think tank colleagues. And I will say that that has been true in both the G7 and G20 space. I'm actually in Washington right now. The first Sherpa meeting of the G20 starts in a half hour. And I think that I would say that the think tank community within the G7 context perhaps will play an outsized role because of the more limited space for think tanks in the G20 presidency this year. So I think there is potentially a special opportunity, but also a special responsibility that falls on you this year. Donc, sur ce point, je conclurai en remerciant encore une fois le CIGI pour son travail and to wish great success to IDDRI and ECFR as you take over the baton and lead the T7 in 2026. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Madam Termoshuizen. And I didn't know that you were just ahead of a meeting of the G20 Sherpas that is going to be probably improvisable, but very interesting. So really, thanks for making the time this morning. And thank also to Paul. I know that Paul needs to take a plane now, so it was really great to have you on board. I will, without further ado, pass the floor to Raphaël Noiret, from who is the head of the G7 G20 mission on international summits at the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs in France. Raphaël, we would be really interested to see in terms of continuity, but also whatever you think needs to be renewed. What are the priorities of the French presidency of the G7? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sébastien. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I will be brief. However, indeed, I have a few things to say as we are, I would say, in the last yards of our preparations for next year on the presidency. The president's ambition, French president's ambition for our presidency is to have an exercise which focuses on global imbalances, which is a very broad notion, but to probably focus on what matters most to us, I will mention global macroeconomic imbalances, which means the fact that as we speak today, the three major economic zones, Europe, the US, and China, are promoting economic models, growth models that are not complementary and that in a way hampers them from being prosperous together, with significant consequences on global trade, innovation, but also with geopolitical tensions. Our ambition is to, in a way, come back to the basics of G7 as it was in 1975 at the Rambouillet summit, which is to bring to the table the largest economies of the world to discuss how to coordinate our economic policies, how to be prosperous together in a world where, indeed, it has been said before, but we are lacking a common understanding of the rules we should be following. And it is precisely when we have, I would say, the least incentive to follow the rules that we need the most and that we need to discuss them together. So in terms of ambition for next year, with inside the Evian summit in mid-June, our ambition is to create the possibility of very open conversations on very difficult topics, with the idea to find common diagnoses on what these imbalances are, find common definitions, common solutions, and also common follow-up mechanisms, and come back to the idea that G7 can set the tone, can set the conversation for a wider environment. In order to do that, we believe that this conversation cannot only happen in G7 only fora. This is why we have the ambition to associate to our summit, but also to preliminary works and including ministerial meetings, when relevant, Sherpa meetings, working groups, to include representatives of other large economies, which are not members of the G7, but are used, I would say, to the G7 environment and can bring something to the table. Our understanding, the president's understanding, is that today G7 alone can find results, and the Canadian presidency has shown it, and the previous presidencies also. However, when it comes to topics such as macroeconomic policies or rethinking the frameworks of ODA, development aid, we need a wider conversation, a more dynamic conversation with countries which do not necessarily think like G7, but to find new forms of consensus. And also, I would say, inject into the global conversation some new trust and also bridges between the so-called North and the so-called global South, which are notions that, in our view, are more and more blurry because we have emerging countries which are now just about as rich as developed countries, and we simply have countries who decide to follow the rules and some who don't. And we believe that our G7 also should be able to emphasize this divide and try to, I would say, bridge the gaps. So within view, the Evian summit, our focus will be very much oriented towards macroeconomic issues. You will have understood that. Also, issues related to ODA, or as we call them now in France, international partnerships, with a view to, I would say, accepting the fact that G7 countries now cannot be the donors that they once were, and that we should rethink together how to avoid ODA fragmentation, how to better channel the aid to those who need it the most, and also, I would say, stimulate the institutional reforms linked to ODA. These would be, I would say, the two main pillars of the summit we're working towards. However, we will also have a wide range of work, which will be channeled into 7 ministerial meetings. 7 ministerial tracks, with at least 1 physical ministerial meeting per track on foreign affairs, with the treatment of crisis, but also on other meetings and the Niagara foreign ministers meeting was quite success in this regard on drug smuggling, on critical minerals, etc. We'll have a finance meeting, which, as you will have understood, will be a very important part of our G7. A trade track, development, digital, with I would say a significant focus on artificial intelligence in the wake of the French summit, which took place in last February. Environment, and finally interior affairs. So to wrap up, our idea is to keep the integrity of the G7 and build upon the legacy of past presidencies, not least the Canadian presidency, which was, as Sherpa Cindy mentioned, very efficient, operational and result-oriented, and this is an example we would love to be able to follow. So building upon previous presidencies on issues such as drug smuggling, such as fighting migrant smuggling, artificial intelligence, just to name a few, but also come back to the basics of a G7, which needs to find new consensus and also to show that it can set the tone for wider conversations. And wider conversations are actually, as Cindy mentioned, happening today. In Washington, our Sous Sherpa will be leading the French delegation on this front, and we hope that we can ensure complementarity between the French G7 and the American G20. We know, to be very open, that we don't necessarily come from the same premises. However, it will be our job to make sure that our presidencies can complement each other and also feed into each other. And this is happening today. We are very excited from the French side to try and make all of this work. We know this is a very, very ambitious task, and for this we will be definitely needing the help of civil society, non-governmental institutions, and not least think tanks, because you are most likely to have the ideas that we will not be having. So in this regard, very, very warm welcome to you all. All the best to Sébastien, IDDRI, and ECFR for next year. We hope to be able to come very soon with proposals for attendance of meetings, be it working groups, Sherpa meetings, ministerials, so that the French presidency can give you feedback on what we want and how we are moving forward, and we can best associate you all to our endeavors. So thank you again, all the best, and from the French side and French MFA, you can also consider that we are at your disposal. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Raphael. This is extremely appreciated, and the way that you've described the priorities is already commented by Paul from CIGI, saying excellent choice of framing in his view. Thanks, Paul, for the comment. I use that, and so thank you, Raphael, because that was really very important at the launch to hear you describe the way you frame the different priorities of France, and that is, as Madame Termos-Huizen was also saying, it's important that we are both practical but also understand how we can participate to the framing that can be broader, and that's exactly what you are doing. I just wanted to tell participants that they are very welcome to ask questions in the chat, either about the T7 structure that is now going to be presented in the next 40 minutes, but also even if you want to raise questions with regard to France's G7 presidency's priorities, don't hesitate to use the chat for that purpose, so that we can really also use those questions and ask them to the participants. I will now give the floor to Agathe Desmarais from ECFR and Céline Kaufmann from IDDRI, so that both of you can present the 2026 T7 organization, the task forces, the priorities, and also how we will function. And I think the floor is now to Agathe.
Thank you very much, Sébastien. Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here with you all today. My name is Agathe Demaré, and I'm the head of the Geoeconomics and Tech program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Delighted to start the T7 process alongside IDDRI. And we wanted first to say a few words about what we're going to be doing in terms of the method for our working groups. And then I know Céline will go on to present some of the IDDRI-led working groups before we switch back to the ECFR side of things for our pillars. So as you will hear a lot today, we will have 4 pillars for the T7 in 2026. We will have 1 pillar on coordinating new industrial policies, led by IDDRI, 1 pillar on financing sustainable development, also led by IDDRI, 1 pillar on high technologies and digitalization, led by ECFR, and 1 pillar on economic security. So essentially, what are we trying to achieve here? Well, I would say that the 3 key words about the way we approach the T7 process is concrete. We're going to try to be as concrete as possible to inform the French G7 presidency. Actionable. We're really trying to have very actionable policies. And that leads me to the 3rd keyword, which is achievable, realistic within the G7 context. We've heard at the start of this event that we're in difficult times, troubled times with all tensions across the world. So it's also about a question to have compromises and achievable policies for G7 economies and like-minded allies. So in terms of the deliverables, what we're going to be doing, well, we're going to front load a lot of the work in the first quarter of 2026 with working groups, and we will discuss the content of these working groups in more detail in a few minutes. But we will hold some virtual working groups in January and February of 2026, so very soon, and we're in the process of setting these up. And then we will draft some solution papers. The co-chairs of the working groups will be drafting the solution papers. It's essentially 2 pages with concrete, actionable, realistic policy proposals for a French presidency of the G7 before we all embark collectively, the T7 participants, in some outreach and advocacy to try to push for these ideas towards our respective governments. So really a compressed timeline, I would say, with a lot to do in the first 2 quarters of 2026, with the idea to try to have some concrete, actionable, achievable policies to present to the French G7 presidencies ahead of the G7 summit that will take place in June in Evian, in the east of France, in the beautiful Alps. Actually, it's going to be a beautiful setting. I will hand over now to Céline Kaufmann, who is going to talk more about the 2 pillars that IDDRI is going to lead before we switch back to the 2 ECFR pillars. Over to you, Céline.
Yeah, thank you very much, Agathe, and good morning, good afternoon to all. We've put together with ECFR a small PowerPoint to make it easier for you to follow the structure of the task forces that we are putting in place. Like Agathe was mentioning, the T7 will cover overall 4 pillars, 2 handled by IDDRI and 2 handled by ECFR. And what I'm going to do now is to focus on the first 2 pillars, the coordination of new industrial policies and the financing of sustainable development that, as you can see from the topics, respond very well to the French priorities. And then Agathe will cover the 2 other pillars that also answer very strongly to the French priorities. At the same time, and if you can go to the next slide, Karine, thank you very much. At the same time, what we want to show you is the composition of the task forces that we are putting together, because the task forces are, based on topics, obviously, and there are topics that we believe can be answered, with these actionable solutions that Agathe was mentioning. But what is important for us is obviously to put together the expertise that is readily available to fit into these 2 pages that the task forces will be developing. We don't have time for new analytical work. So we need, that the think tanks and the individuals that will be contributing to these task forces are immediately able to provide, some ways forward and to engage together, because this is the big value of the T7, is to actually bridge across different jurisdictions, across countries, across think tanks, to reflect on the feasible trajectories ahead. On the side of IDDRI, the task forces that we're putting together under these two pillars relate to first, secure, responsible, and equitable value chains for critical minerals. We heard it from the Canadian Sherpa. This is a topic where there have been advances both from the G7 and from the G20, and where we believe that the T7 can help build a bridge between the G7 and the G20 on issues both related to security of access, which is more of importing countries, consideration, and on the value addition for producing countries, which has been very much put forward within the context of the G20. This is a task force that is co-led by Chatham House and Southern Transitions. So Chatham House from the UK and Southern Transitions from South Africa. The second subtopic and task force that we are establishing under this coordination of industrial policy has to do with strengthening coherence between investment agreements and sustainable development commitments. And this is very much related to the fact that we can see efforts going on to reform the international investment regime and make it more supportive of sustainable development. At the same time, we can see the multiplication of investment and trade deals to secure value chains. So we believe that the task force can focus on developing concrete solutions for the G7 to ensure that trade and investment agreements, including their investment chapters, effectively support sustainable development objectives and promote balanced and mutually beneficial relationships with partner countries. This is a task force that will be co-chaired by IDOS from Germany and ECO from Italy. We are still considering a third task force as part of this first pillar, but for the timing, it hasn't been put in place, and we're still trying to understand the appetite for it, which is related to reforming inefficient subsidies to free up fiscal space for key industrial sectors. But now moving on to the second pillar on financing development, it is a pillar that will very much build on the Paris Summit for a new global financing pact that took place in June 2023, including the Paris Pact for People and the Planet, the 4P, and that will build as well on the financing commons, the FIX, and will bring G7 and non-G7 countries together to reflect on resource mobilization and effective use of finance for development. The first subtopic that we will be addressing is related towards a more effective and integrated public development bank system, and will be very much focused to differentiate from a G20 agenda on the national development banks with three objectives. The first one is to provide practical recommendations on how to strengthen national development banks as facilitators between national priorities and development finance, connecting with the discussion on country platform. The second one is on consolidating their role as bridges between public finance and private finance to mobilize resources more effectively. And the third one is on managing increasingly limited concessional funds more efficiently. This is a task force that will be co-chaired by FinDev Lab in France and the Development Finance Research Program at Peking University in China. The second subtopic in this pillar relates to enhancing insurability against natural disasters, which is very much as well a topic that was put forward very strongly by Canada under the topic of wildfires, and by South Africa under different discussions, natural disasters, but also resilience. And this is where we believe that the the task force can provide very concrete suggestions to improve financial protection against natural disasters, anticipate burden sharing between the insurance industry and the public authorities, and mobilize financing for vulnerable countries. This is a task force that will actually be co-chaired by E3G, the US office in E3G, and the Institut Louis Bachelier of France. And the last topic before I give back the floor to Agathe, under the Finance for Development pillar, is related to standardizing and strengthening accountability for biodiversity finance, because we believe there is an opportunity to advance an incremental agenda on the topic of nature and biodiversity finance, because financial commitments for biodiversity remain difficult to compare with IFIs or public banks still using different metrics and definitions, as well as the private sector. We know there's an ongoing effort, and it's a trajectory that has to be taken, but we believe the T7 can really provide input on that. And the co-chairs for that task force are the University of Tokyo in Japan and CIGI of India. And with that, I suggest to hand over the floor to hear about the other two pillars back to ECFR, Agathe. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Céline. And I see that my wonderful colleague, Nacho Torreblanca, has just turned on his webcam. Perfect timing. So perhaps we can move to the next slide, if that's possible. I see the slides popping up, which is absolutely lovely. Amazing. Thank you so much for whoever did that. I'm not sure I know. So on the ECFR side of things, we will have two pillars, as we were mentioning a few minutes ago. The first pillar is about economic security, and we will have two working groups in that field. And then the second pillar is about innovation, tech, high tech, AI, and I will leave it to my colleague Nacho Torreblanca to talk about these. But first, on the first two working groups that have to do with economic security, what are we trying to do here? Well, we will have a first working group dealing with economic statecraft, lessons learned from recent developments. Of course, we're thinking about Ukraine, and this working group will probably talk a lot about lessons learned from our experience with supporting Ukraine and challenges ahead. So a very forward-looking perspective. And it's really about this, trying to have a think about economic statecraft, because what we've seen over the past years is that the G7 has been the relevant network and grouping for a lot of economic statecraft. We've seen, for instance, a lot of sanctions being imposed on Moscow through the G7. I'm thinking here, for instance, of the G7 oil price cap, but also the G7-led ERA loans to Ukraine, which are actually the first source of financing, external financing for Ukraine at the moment. So without going into the detail, we're thrilled actually to have received a lot of positive responses to join this working group from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the Institut Montaigne in France, SWP in Germany, the Kiev School of Economics, which we think will be absolutely wonderful to have, and IISS in the UK, and the ROD Corporation in the US to join this working group, which has been extremely popular. It's rare actually to send invitations and to get that many yeses to our invitations. And then the second working group in the economic security pillar, before I turn to you, Nacho, and I see that we both have our wonderful branded virtual backgrounds, which are very popular. I'm getting a lot of messages about these, actually. The second working group is going to be about boosting economic security collaboration among G7 economies and like-minded allies. You'll see that in this working group, for instance, we will reach out to Australia as a like-minded ally. So the rationale behind this working group is essentially that one thing that we hear a lot from the private sector is that they would love to have some more unified rules for economic security. All these conversations, and we think that there is a lot of work to do on this front. We can think, for instance, of small parcels and economic security related issues for these very small parcels that don't go through customs, for instance, in the European Union. So we're thrilled again to see that we'll have a number of think tanks join us for this one, also extremely popular working group, Round Europe, which is a UK institution, actually UK or Dutch, l'Institut Mobilité en Transition, which I think works very closely with IDDRI, CINAS in the US, which has done a lot of work on all topics related to economic security and the intersection between economic security and trade policies, the German Marshall Fund, Germany, ISPI in Italy. We also have a representative from Carleton University in Canada and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and ASPI, as I was mentioning, in Australia. But I don't want to monopolize the conversation, and I know that Nacho has a lot to say about the innovation tech AI pillar of the ECFR-led working group. So I'll hand over to you, Nacho. Over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much again, and it's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. Thank you, of course, to Celine and Sebastian at IDDRI for helping us put this together. It was also great to have Paul and the people from CIGI here. I think what we want to do in this pillar is very closely related to what Rafael just mentioned in terms of global imbalances. If there is one place where there are global imbalances which are very, very worrying, apart from the other ones, is of course on AI investments and AI diffusion. We feel that the concentration of investments, it makes very difficult for other countries to be able, especially middle powers or mid-sized countries. It accentuates inequality. It makes regulation much more difficult, and it makes countries more vulnerable or dependent to others. So, dealing with this concentration and with the global imbalances in AI investments, in terms of the barriers to frontier AI development and the training of models, we think it is very important, because this great power competition, of course, turns into fragmentation, and export controls also make turn into bottlenecks, which prevent countries from having a safe access. And I think we think this is very much in the line of as Cindy just mentioned, on the group which the T7 in the Canadian presidency put together on the declaration in June 2025, where I quote the declaration on AI and prosperity said, "We hear the concerns of emerging markets about building resilient AI ecosystems and the risk of disruption." So, we would very much want to take on that line in order to further look at how to promote more plurilateral investments, more or a better diffusion of technology, and better and more secure access to these key investments in order to reduce these global imbalances and the economic, social, and geopolitical consequences for countries. And for that, we've tried, putting together a working group, which, as it was said by Sebastian, that wants to reach out of strictly what the T7 and G7 members are, in order to make this link, as in other workshops, with the T20 and the G20. Thank you, Agathe.
And I think, Celine, if you want to say a few more words. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Agathe and Nacho. It was very helpful. We are coming now to the part of the session where we wanted to do two things. The first one was to acknowledge the great diversity of the think tanks that will be joining the T7. And as you could see from our respective slides, you'll see that a lot, between 50 and 60 think tanks will be involved in the T7 in various capacities, as co-chairs or as participants to the task force, both from G7 countries and from non-G7 countries. And we really look forward to working with all of you. The second thing we wanted to do as well is to give you an opportunity to ask questions in the chat. And I can see there's a couple of questions. There are questions that are actually addressed to the French authorities. And I would suggest that maybe, Tristan, in your final intervention, you take them up. So there's one from Guillaume Potier, I4C, that was asking about the relationship between the 7 ministerial meetings that will take place during the G7 and the G7 tracks. How, are they going to relate? Are they going to be several tracks feeding into one ministerial and vice versa? I can also see a question that is actually coming to us from Samantha that is reflecting on the comments that Raphael made on the fact that the reform of ODA would be a priority for France and how we would potentially take it up as part of the T7. And I do think this is in particular addressed to the task force that will be working on the national development banks and the future, how to manage concessional finance. And I would suggest that this is potentially a question that we reflect on at the first meeting of the task force that is taking place very soon now or in January. Do we have any other questions? I don't see that. Do we have any co-chair who wants to say a word? So, Agathe, if you agree, unless you have
there is a
additional
question, excuse me, Céline, there is a question by Rosana Santos who said that she could not bring her camera on. And she's asking if there is interest in participating in another working group. Is that possible?
That's a very good question. What we've tried to do, and organizing the T7 is a bit of a puzzle in a way, is to allocate the think tanks across the different task forces so that we had a balanced representation of countries, G7 and non-G7 countries overall across the 4 pillars. And we try not to repeat the think tanks, meaning that we try to have different think tanks to allow for diversity across the different task forces. So I hope it answers the question. Agathe, you want to jump in?
If there is a strong willingness, please email us. We'll see what we can do. I don't want to say no without knowing more. But as Céline's mentioned, we've tried to do our best to invite as many think tanks as possible to some working groups. But again, if there is some strong willingness, we could maybe try to make it work. So I don't want to say no. And I think, Céline, you were about to say we would move to the next section. And I think this is perfectly fine. Yeah,
I do think that we can move to the next session. And just to mention that, of course, Agathe and I and, IDRI, Sébastien and IDRI and ECFR's team are available to answer any question you may have. Do not hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll do our most to answer your questions.
Well,
Sébastien.
Yes,
please.
Thank you very much, Céline, Agathe, and to all the co-chairs who made it to be present today. I think what we would like to do now is really to give back the floor to Tristan Auro, the head of policy planning at the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs in France, for some concluding words, but also if you can, Tristan, or if Raphael is still there, answer the question by Guillaume Potier on the idea to have a so-called jumbo ministerial meeting that merged several tracks, finance and development, finance and environment, for instance, to see if this is a possibility and how we could also bring something to these types of interacting tracks. I see that there is also a question by Naoko Ishii in the chat. Let me just, Tristan, please take stock of what I read. Naoko is saying, if we want to be practical, actionable, and achievable, are we sure that think tanks are good at that? We need to be true to science and principles in this very confusing world. So thanks a lot, Naoko, for this comment. And I think this is exactly the tension in which we are assuming that think tanks are good at, not to lose the North Star in terms of science and principles, but also at the same time to really understand the constraints of the political agenda and try to find the very tiny path that makes it possible to have meaningful and very relevant suggestions that are potentially accessible in the very short time frame of a G7 presidency. That puts a lot of challenges on the shoulder of the co-chairs. So we are really aware of that. But I believe, dear Naoko, that this is a very an ongoing conversations that we need to have in terms of what is it that we propose to the Sherpas. I believe, as Cindy Termorshuysen was saying at the beginning, what she really appreciated in the relation between her as a Sherpa to the G7 presidency and the think tanks was that the think tanks were both trying to be very close to what could be achievable in the political negotiation, but also linking that to narratives that were broadening the narrative to something that also works on the framing of the overall questions. And so this is a very, I'm not sure that I have a relevant enough answer to Naoko Ishii, but I just wanted to say that this is, of course, extremely challenging and very present in the work that we do. And we are very interested within the T7 to see how we navigate that, and might come back to CIGI to understand how they did that in the Canadian context, because that's going to be extremely important. Last thing that I wanted to say, sorry, Tristan, I called you on and then I saw the message in the chat. The one thing that I also want to mention is that with ECFR, we are extremely interested to connect to the T20 under the American presidency. I believe for the moment, our information on the structure of the T20 and who is responsible for that is not sufficient for us to say anything about that now. But we really believe that in terms of understanding also what is feasible and what is it that we need to push forward in the G7 context to also be a little bit more forward-looking than the very complex G20 negotiations. Or so this is probably something that is also part of the equation to see how the T7 is related to the T20. Now, really, excuse me for having you waited that much, Tristan. I give you the floor. If you have the way to answer Guillaume's question on the way on, that would be great. But we are really looking forward to your words of conclusion.
Thank you very much, Sébastien. It's a pleasure to see you all. I must confess that I'm slightly jealous about the back images you're all using, and mine is pretty blank, but I'll try to make it so that next time I have a better one. But very pleased to be following your conversation, engaging with all of you. I must say that I'd like to most sincerely thank you, Sébastien, Agathe, Céline, IDDRI, and ECFR, the whole teams for the amazing work you've been doing in advance of this meeting, and that you will be carrying out as we move forward in the coming months. I just wanted to add a few elements to what's been discussed and said already. My colleague Raphael presented the main priorities of our G7 presidency. I must say that this presidency will be taking place in a rather challenging international environment, with the return of great power competition and the pressure this is creating on multilateral and minilateral formats and institutions. That's one. And second, the fact that the G7 as a format is being contested, and we all know and see the importance of emerging new formats. BRICS is certainly one of them, and it is in this international reality that we will have together collectively to navigate in the context of that presidency. And I must say that in this challenging and fast evolving geopolitical context, to answer what's been said about think tanks just now, I think that think tanks in your diversity, coming from all those countries that are being represented today around the table, are ideally placed actually to propose solutions and think outside the box, which is certainly something that is of most value. And the working groups that have been presented by Agathe and Celine, in their diversity and their ability to bring together a key and leading think tank and institutions all around the world, will be incredible spaces to allow for frank discussions and provide the right venues to think differently. And that is of utmost value to actually fuel the discussions that will take place in ministerial, Sherpa, and leaders tracks. And I must say that the fact that in each and every working group, there is a composition in which there are actors from all G7 countries and beyond, and Rafael made a reference to the outreach, which will be a key dimension of our G7 presidency, will make it so that this discussion will allow all of you today to test ideas with counterparts, and that will certainly enrich our common understanding of the way forward on every topic that will be touched upon. One thing I wanted to add is that Rafael mentioned the Evian Summit as certainly the key moment in the coming months at leaders level, and that will be sort of a key event of our presidency. There will be the ministerial meetings as well. And on top of it, I just wanted to briefly refer to the fact that there will be a series of international events that will not be G7 per se, but that will be providing important moments to generate and discuss ideas. Just to name a few, I'm thinking about the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi. I'm thinking about the One Health Summit in Lyon, or the AI Summit in India in February. These will be key multilateral gatherings in which France and the French diplomacy will be heavily involved, and which will be points and moments where basically we will have opportunities to also extend to other actors or test ideas that will be developed in the G7 tracks. So coming back to the question of the ministerial tracks and the articulation between the T7 and different tracks that we will be conducting in the French G7 presidency. I must say that I'm not aware of jumbo ministerial meetings. So as Rafael said, there will be a limited number, 7 actually, ministerial tracks. I just want to point to the fact that the Sherpa track is certainly cross-cutting by nature, and that on top of the Sherpa track, there will be a track of policy planners, of which I will be part, together with my colleagues from other G7 countries, and that this policy planning track will certainly be cross-cutting as well on substance, and a good venue to actually channel issues in a cross-cutting and not silo approach. And I finally want to convey on that question that the French presidency, so the Élysée, is certainly paying a lot of attention to the ideas that will come up in the T7, And just to refer back to what Agathe said on basically having solution papers that will be short, action-oriented, and concrete. This is a strong expectation from the French presidency, the Élysée, the president and his team, to actually use directly those solutions paper to fuel the discussion at their level. So big thanks to IDDRI and ECFR in coordinating together with all of you this work, which will be of utmost importance. When it comes to the topics, I certainly don't want to repeat what's been said already. The working groups are actually fitting perfectly into the priorities that have been presented by Raphael. As was said, there will be at leaders level quite a lot of attention paid to macroeconomic issues, but when it comes to the different ministerial tracks, there will be a lot of attention being paid to all the topics that have been mentioned, be it development finance, be it economic security, the digitalization of economies, and so on and so forth. So I'll end up there. But again, thanking our Canadian colleagues in France, and CIGI did an incredible work, and the way it was presented right at the beginning of this meeting exemplified it, and the words of our Canadian Sherpa and colleague showed the extent to which the work carried out by Paul Sampson was extremely useful. So it's exactly what we want to do, and just to use what the Canadian Sherpa said in terms of continuity, that's certainly a key word for us, not to reinvent the wheel, but actually build upon what's been developed by our predecessors, make it grow. And for this, we will count on your participation. So thanks a lot again to IDDRI and ECFR for carrying that important work. And this meeting testifies and the extent to which this will be a collective endeavor for which we count on all of you. So thank you very much, Sébastien and to all.
Thank you very much, Tristan, for these very enthusiastic, that produces enthusiasm in us for these encouraging words for our work as think tanks. Extremely well noted. And we really are looking forward to the possibility of, as Raphael was saying, the moments where you believe attendance from our part could be useful in the conversations with the different Sherpas or the different meetings. Thanks a lot for that. I just wanted to acknowledge that there is another comment in the chat from Tom Janvier on how to relate with the reform of the international financial architecture, given the risk of potential US blockages. And I believe one of the points that we are, in terms of continuity, is that we are looking within the T7 framework to see how the G7 and with its outreach could be in some instances complementing, if not substituting, to the G20 under the US presidency, if there is not enough accountability, for instance, on the evolution roadmap of the MDB. So this is something that we are going to look at as think tanks. I'm not sure, Tristan, you want to react on that question, but you don't need to. It's just
I can just say, I mean, the G20 Sherpa is taking place literally as we speak. So I'm actually looking forward to getting more information out of this Sherpa meeting taking place now to see how to best articulate the two. But it's certainly our intention here in the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs to liaise closely with our US counterparts and see how to best approach the fact that the French presidency of the G7 will take place at the same time with the US presidency of the G20. So just to quickly underline that this is high up on our minds.
Thank you very much, Tristan. and this is definitely something that we are in the financing sustainable development pillar of the T7 are also going to look particularly into. So I just wanted to finally thank you, Tristan, Raphael, for having been with us, Paul Sampson from CIGI, and Deputy Minister Cindy Termors-Huijsen. That was really good to have all these presidencies of G7 with us on board, and the presidency of T7 of last year. Also want to thank the ECFR colleagues, Nacho, Agathe, Suzy, for the very good collaboration, and all the think tanks who made it today to participate, ask questions, show that they are present. We really thank you very much, because that was a very important launch for this T7 for next year. So now we are going to be working quite heavily in the coming weeks and months, because this is going to be, as the earlier we have some first suggestions to be brought to your conversations in the G7 setting, the more relevant we would be, and then engaging in a conversation with you. So this is really the moment where we probably have some break over the end of the year, but still we are going to be very actively working on these different pillars and working groups. Thanks a lot again. See you soon for the further meetings of the outputs of the T7. Thank you and bye-bye.